When the audience heard a daughter say, "Thank you for never giving up," Steve Harvey's world stopped. The microphone in his hand trembled. His eyes, which had sparkled with jokes just seconds before, now glistened with tears he couldn't hide. The entire studio fell into a silence so profound that even the camera operators forgot to move. This wasn't part of the script. This wasn't planned. This was the moment when a game show became something far more powerful than entertainment. But to understand why Steve Harvey, a man who had hosted thousands of episodes and faced every imaginable situation on stage, completely broke down that day, we need to go back to where this story truly began. Not in the studio. Not during the taping. But in a small apartment where a father made a promise to his daughter that would change both their lives forever. The Johnson family had driven 11 hours to get to the family Feud studio. Mark Johnson, a 52-year-old construction worker from Ohio, sat in the passenger seat while his daughter Sarah drove. In the back seat were Mark's wife Linda, his mother Dorothy, and his son Michael. They had won the lottery to be contestants on the show, but for Mark, this trip meant something deeper than a chance to win money. 3 years earlier, Mark had lost his job when the construction company he worked for went bankrupt. Then his health insurance lapsed. Then came the diagnosis: early-stage cancer. The treatments drained what little savings they had. Sarah, who was in her final year of college, had to drop out to work 2 jobs to help support the family. Mark watched his daughter sacrifice her dreams because of his illness, and it destroyed him in ways the cancer never could. "I'm going to beat this," he told Sarah every single day. "And you're going back to school. I promise you." Even when the treatments made him so weak he could barely stand. Even when the bills piled so high they lost their house and moved into a 2-bedroom apartment. Even when Sarah cried herself to sleep thinking her father might not survive, Mark never stopped saying those words. "I'm going to beat this." Steve stopped mid-joke. The entire studio froze. The Johnson family stood at their podium, and Steve Harvey was doing what he did best, making people laugh. He had just asked them about their most embarrassing family moments, and Mark's mother Dorothy had given an answer so funny that even the opposing family was doubled over laughing. The game was going well. The energy was perfect. Everything was exactly as it should be. But then Steve noticed something. Mark was holding Sarah's hand so tightly his knuckles had turned white. And Sarah wasn't laughing like everyone else. She was staring at her father with an expression Steve had seen before, but never quite like this. It was gratitude mixed with relief mixed with something else he couldn't quite name. Steve's producer voice came through his earpiece. "Steve, we need to move to the next question." But Steve Harvey had spent 30 years reading people, and something in this moment told him to stop. So he did something he had never done before. He put his cards down, stepped away from his podium, and walked directly to the Johnson family. The laughter died. The audience went silent. Even the cameras seemed to pause, unsure if they should keep rolling. "Hold on," Steve said, his voice different now, softer. "Before we go on, I need to know something." He looked at Mark, then at Sarah. "There's a story here. I can feel it. And I think it needs to be told." Mark's eyes filled with tears immediately. Sarah squeezed his hand tighter. The rest of the family looked at each other, unsure what was happening. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't how game shows worked. "Sir?" Steve said to Mark. "What's your daughter's name?" "Sarah," Mark answered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah," Steve repeated, turning to her. "Why are you looking at your dad like that?" Subscribe and leave a comment because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Sarah looked at her father, then at Steve, then back at her father. Her lips trembled. "Because," she said, fighting through tears, 3 years ago, my dad got cancer. We lost everything. I had to leave college. We lost our house. There were nights I thought we were going to lose him too." The audience gasped. Several people in the front row were already crying. Steve Harvey stood perfectly still, letting Sarah speak. "But every single day," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger, "every single day, Even when he was so sick he couldn't get out of bed, he would look at me and say, "I'm going to beat this. And you're going back to school. I promise you." And I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't see how. I couldn't see how we would make it. Mark's tears were flowing freely now. His wife Linda wrapped her arm around his shoulders. His mother Dorothy pulled out a tissue. 2 months ago, Sarah said, my dad got the call. He's cancer-free. Completely cancer-free. And last week, he handed me a check. He had been saving every penny he made from working double shifts. It was enough to pay for my final year of college. The audience erupted in applause, but Steve held up his hand, stopping them. Because he saw something in Mark's face. Something that said this story wasn't finished yet. "Mr. Johnson," Steve said, his voice thick with emotion. "Is that true? You worked double shifts while recovering from cancer to send your daughter back to school?" Mark nodded, unable to speak. "Why?" Steve asked. "Why push yourself like that?" Behind the scenes, Steve made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. Mark wiped his eyes and finally found his voice. "Because she gave up her dreams for me. The least I could do was fight for hers." He turned to Sarah. "You worked 2 jobs so I could get treatment. You held my hand through every chemotherapy session. You never complained, not once. I watched you sacrifice everything, and all I could think was, I have to survive this. Because if I don't, she'll never forgive herself. And if I do survive, I have to make it right." Steve Harvey, who had hosted this show for years, who had seen every kind of family and heard every kind of story, stood there with tears streaming down his face. He didn't try to hide them. He didn't make a joke to lighten the mood. He just let himself feel it. The cameras captured everything. The opposing family had moved from their podium and were now standing near the Johnsons, some of them crying too. The audience was completely silent except for the sound of tissues being pulled from purses and pockets. And then Sarah turned to her father and said the words that would break not just Steve Harvey, but everyone watching. "Dad, thank you for never giving up. Not on yourself. Not on me. Not on us. You promised me you would beat it, and you did. You promised I'd go back to school, and I am. You kept every single promise, even when keeping them almost killed you." Mark pulled his daughter into a hug so tight it looked like he might never let go. And in that moment, something shifted in the studio. This was no longer a game show. This was a testament to what a father's love could survive. This was proof that some promises are worth any sacrifice. Steve Harvey walked back to his podium slowly. He picked up his cards, looked at them, and then set them back down. "We're going to take a break," he announced to the audience. "Because I need a minute. And I think all of you do too." But he didn't walk off stage. Instead, he walked back to Mark Johnson. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. Steve Harvey took off his jacket. His signature 3-piece suit jacket that he wore in every episode, the one that had become part of his identity on this show. He folded it carefully and handed it to Mark Johnson. "Sir," Steve said, "I've been doing this show for a long time. I've met a lot of families. I've heard a lot of stories. But what you did? Working double shifts while recovering from cancer? Saving every penny so your daughter could finish school? That's not just being a father. That's being a hero." Mark tried to protest, tried to give the jacket back, but Steve wouldn't take it. "No," Steve said firmly. "You keep this. And every time you look at it, I want you to remember something. I want you to remember that your daughter is going to graduate. I want you to remember that you beat cancer. And I want you to remember that today, in this studio, you showed everyone watching what real strength looks like." The audience stood up. All of them. 200 people rising to their feet, applauding so loudly it echoed off the studio walls. The opposing family was applauding too. The producers were applauding. Even the camera crew put down their equipment to clap. But Steve wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone and made a call right there on stage. "Hello?" he said into the phone. "Yes, this is Steve Harvey from Family Feud. I'm standing here with a man named Mark Johnson who just beat cancer and worked himself to exhaustion to send his daughter back to college." He paused, listening. "Yes, I'm serious. Listen, his daughter Sarah had to drop out in her final year. She's going back now, but they used everything they had. I want to know if there's anything we can do to help." He was calling his foundation. Right there, live, in front of everyone. 5 minutes later, Steve announced that his foundation would be covering not just Sarah's final year, but all of her remaining costs, including books, housing, and a stipend for living expenses. "And," Steve added, "we're going to set up a college fund for your son Michael too. Because if your family is anything like what I've seen today, he deserves that chance as well." Mark Johnson collapsed. Not from weakness, but from the weight of what had just happened. His wife and mother caught him, and Sarah wrapped her arms around all of them. They stood there, this family who had lost everything and fought to rebuild, crying in front of millions of viewers, held up by each other and by the generosity of a man who understood what it meant to struggle. Steve Harvey stood back, watching them, wiping his own tears with the back of his hand. Later, he would tell his producers that this was why he did the show. Not for the ratings. Not for the fame. But for moments like this. For the chance to witness real human courage and, when possible, to do something about it. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. The game continued eventually. The Johnsons won $20,000, which they immediately said would go into savings for emergencies. But the money wasn't the story. The story was Mark Johnson's jacket, Steve Harvey's jacket actually, that hung in Sarah's college dorm room for the next year as a reminder of the day her father's promise came true. The story was how the episode, when it aired, went viral. How millions of people watched Steve Harvey break down on stage and remembered their own fathers, their own struggles, their own promises kept against impossible odds. The story was how Steve started a new segment on his show called Promises Kept, where he would highlight families who had overcome incredible obstacles to take care of each other. The story was how Mark Johnson, 3 years cancer-free now, volunteers at a cancer support center, telling newly diagnosed patients about the day he stood on a game show stage and his daughter thanked him for never giving up. And the story was how Sarah Johnson graduated with honors, became a social worker, and dedicated her career to helping families navigate the financial and emotional challenges of serious illness. In her office, hanging on the wall behind her desk, is Steve Harvey's jacket in a frame, with a plaque that reads, "Some promises are worth everything." Steve Harvey would later say in interviews that this was the moment that changed how he saw his role on Family Feud. "I used to think I was just there to make people laugh and give away some money," he said. "But after that day with the Johnsons, I realized I'm there to witness people's humanity. To see them at their best. And sometimes, if I'm lucky, to help make their promises come true." The jacket became a symbol. Other contestants would ask about it, and Steve would tell them the story of Mark Johnson, the father who worked double shifts while recovering from cancer. The father who saved every penny. The father who kept his promise. And somewhere in Ohio, Mark Johnson wears that jacket to every important family event. His daughter's graduation. His son's high school ceremony. His wife's birthday. His mother's 80th birthday party. Because it's not just a jacket. It's proof that promises kept, sacrifices made, and love given freely are never forgotten. They echo forward, changing not just one family, but everyone who hears their story. That day in the Family Feud studio, Steve Harvey didn't just host a game show. He bore witness to the power of a father's love and a daughter's gratitude. And in doing so, he reminded millions of viewers of something they had perhaps forgotten, that the real victories in life aren't measured in money won or games played, but in promises kept and families held together through the darkest storms. The world watched Steve Harvey break down that day. But what they were really watching was a moment of pure, unfiltered human connection. A reminder that behind every family standing at that podium, there's a story of struggle, sacrifice, and survival. And sometimes, just sometimes, there's a man willing to stop the show, take off his jacket, and say, "Your story matters." Your sacrifice matters. You matter. And that is why Steve Harvey isn't just a game show host. He's a reminder that humanity, compassion, and the willingness to witness each other's pain can change everything. One daughter. One father. One promise kept. One moment that proved love is the only currency that truly matters.